It started with a phone call that should have never been answered because at 2:14 a.m. in Chicago, a 27-year-old man named Ethan Carter received a notification from Airbnb that his booking in a remote Oregon forest cabin had been confirmed even though he clearly remembered canceling it hours earlier. And before he could even process that, a message popped up from the host saying, "You're finally back." Even though Ethan had never stayed there before in his life, and that one message alone should have made him stop everything. But instead, curiosity and exhaustion pushed him forward, and within minutes he found himself looking at the listing again. A deeply isolated wooden cabin surrounded by endless pine forest. No roads nearby, no neighbors, just pure silence. And the price was so low, almost felt like a mistake. But what made it worse was that the listing had no recent reviews except one strange line repeated 3 times by different accounts saying, "Don't go after sunset." And Ethan should have ignored it, but instead he booked it impulsively thinking it was just internet trolling. And the next morning he drove for almost 6 hours into Oregon's deep forest, where GPS kept glitching and signal dropped completely as if the road itself didn't want him there. And when he finally arrived, the air felt immediately wrong, heavy, and still like the forest was holding its breath. And the cabin stood alone with a slightly tilted structure, old wood, and a porch light flickering. Even though it was daytime, and as he stepped out of the car, the first thing he noticed was that there were already footprints in the dirt leading from the cabin into the forest and then back inside again, as if someone had been pacing around for hours before he arrived. But there were no cars, no people, no signs of life anywhere. And yet the door was unlocked even though the lockbox code had worked. And inside, everything was clean but unsettlingly perfect, like a place that was staged instead of lived in. And the temperature dropped instantly the moment he entered. And that's when he noticed something that made his stomach tighten: a basement door under the stairs, old wooden planks reinforced with a thick metal lock, and above it a handwritten note that said, "Do not open after dark." And even though he tried to ignore it, something about the way the lock looked disturbed him, because it wasn't just locked, it looked like it had been locked from both sides. And when evening started falling faster than expected, the forest outside turned completely silent. No wind, no insects, no birds, just a dead, unnatural quiet. And at 11:03 p.m., while Ethan was scrolling his phone with no signal, he heard the first sound, a single slow knock coming from beneath the floor, and he froze thinking maybe it was pipes, but then the knock came again, stronger, followed by dragging sounds like something heavy shifting below him, and then silence so deep it felt physical. And for a full minute nothing moved until the basement door suddenly made a small metallic click as if something inside had touched the lock, and Ethan slowly stood up feeling his heart pound. And that's when a whisper came through the floorboard saying his name clearly, "Ethan, open it." And he stepped back instantly because there was no way anyone should know his name in a place like this. And he checked his phone again, but there was still no signal. And then the lights flickered once, and the entire house temperature dropped again. And now he could hear footsteps inside the cabin upstairs, even though he had never gone up there, slow, deliberate steps pacing from one end to the other. And Ethan grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the stairs, but halfway there the footsteps stopped completely. And in that silence he heard something even worse, breathing, not loud, but steady, coming from inside the walls themselves. And then suddenly a loud bang came from the basement door, so strong it shook the entire cabin. And Ethan jumped back as the metal lock on the door began to move slightly on its own, like something inside was testing it. And then the whisper came again, but closer, "You came back late." And that sentence didn't make sense, but felt like it was spoken by someone who already knew him. And Ethan rushed into the kitchen grabbing a knife, shouting, "Who is there?" But the only answer was another knock, this time from every wall at once, surrounding him. And then all lights died completely, leaving only darkness and faint moonlight through windows. And in that darkness he heard multiple footsteps moving around him in circles, not random, but coordinated like people surrounding him slowly. And then the basement door lock snapped loudly and fell open by itself. And the door creaked downward, revealing only blackness that felt deeper than the room itself. And Ethan backed into the living room when suddenly the guest book on the table flipped open on its own page, and fresh writing appeared that wasn't there before, saying, "You were not the first to arrive tonight. And at that moment, every sound stopped completely. And then behind him, he heard the front door slowly unlocking even though he hadn't touched it. And it opened just a few inches, revealing nothing but pitch black outside. And then the whisper came again from the doorway, saying, "We kept your room ready." And Ethan ran upstairs, looking for an exit window, but the hallway felt longer than before, like it was stretching, and every room he passed was empty but felt occupied at the same time, like something was standing just out of sight watching him. And when he reached the top floor, he saw the attic door slightly open, even though it had been closed before, and from inside came slow breathing. And then a voice spoke from within the attic saying, "You shouldn't have answered the booking." And Ethan froze because that was exactly what had started this. And as he stepped back, the attic door opened wider by itself, revealing only darkness, but something inside moved closer, and then a shape stepped into view, not fully human, tall and wrong in proportion, standing perfectly still at the top of the stairs watching him without blinking. And in that moment, Ethan tried to run, but the hallway behind him was already filled with more shapes, standing silently. And the only exit left was the basement door, now fully open. And as he turned toward it, he heard the final whisper right behind his ear, saying, "You checked in before you arrived." And after that, Ethan was never seen again. But 3 days later, when police entered the cabin, they found everything perfectly clean, no signs of struggle, no broken locks, no footprints, except for one strange detail. The guest book had new names written in it, including Ethan Carter's name at the very top, dated 2 days before he ever booked the place. And the Airbnb listing still appears, sometimes online for a few minutes at random times before disappearing again. But those who have seen it say the same thing, that if you read the reviews carefully enough, you will always find one repeating warning hidden in different words. Don't open the basement because someone is already inside waiting for the next guest. It started with a booking made out of exhaustion, not excitement. When a 28-year-old man named Caleb Morgan from Texas, USA, found a remote Airbnb farmhouse in rural Tennessee that promised peaceful countryside isolation. But what caught his attention wasn't the photos or price. It was the reviews section, where multiple guests had left the same disturbing line in different words. "Don't stay alone after midnight," and Caleb ignored it, thinking it was just people trying to be dramatic online. But the moment he confirmed the booking, the host, a man named Harold Finch, sent a message that made him pause for a second longer than he should have. "If you hear knocking from the attic at night, do not respond, no matter what." And there was no explanation, no smiley, no context, just that sentence. And Caleb felt a slight discomfort, but still drove out the next morning, entering roads that slowly turned from highway to empty countryside, then to narrow dirt paths surrounded by dense trees, until his phone lost signal completely and silence took over everything. And when he finally reached the farmhouse, it already felt wrong because it was too still, like the air itself had stopped moving, and the house stood alone in an open field with tall grass swaying slightly even though there was no wind, and the front porch light was already on despite it being daytime. And when Caleb stepped out of the car, the first thing he noticed was that the front door was slightly open even though the lockbox code was correct, and that immediately made him uncomfortable. But he told himself maybe the host forgot to close it. So he stepped inside, and the moment he entered, the temperature dropped sharply like walking into a cold basement, and the interior looked clean but strangely lifeless, like a house prepared for someone who never actually lived there. And then he noticed something that made his stomach tighten slightly. A narrow wooden staircase leading up to an attic with a thick iron chain wrapped around the door handle, and above it a handwritten note that simply said, "Do not open after sunset." And Caleb stared at it for a moment before shaking his head, convincing himself it was probably just old storage. But as evening approached faster than expected, the sky outside turned dark gray, and the farmhouse became unnaturally quiet. No insects, no wind, nothing. And at 10:41 p.m., while Caleb was sitting in the living room, scrolling his phone with no signal, he heard the first sound, a faint knock coming from directly above him. And he froze, looking up at the ceiling, and then it came again, knock, knock, but slower this time. And he stood up slowly, thinking maybe it was just with shifting, but then the chain on the attic door made a faint metallic sound like it was being pulled from the other side. And Caleb's breathing got heavier because that chain was supposed to be tightly locked. And then everything went silent. So silent it felt like the house had stopped existing. And then a whisper came from above him saying very clearly, "Don't answer." And Caleb backed away instinctively because the voice didn't sound like it was coming from outside. It sounded like it was inside the ceiling itself. And he quickly checked his phone again. Still no signal. And then at exactly 11:13 p.m., the lights flickered once, then again, and dimmed slightly. And that's when the footsteps started upstairs, slow and steady, walking from one side of the attic to the other, even though Caleb had not gone up there, and he stood completely still trying to listen, and the footsteps suddenly stopped right above him. And then there was a long pause before a second set of footsteps joined in, like something else had entered the attic, and Caleb slowly grabbed a flashlight from the table and moved toward the stairs. And halfway up, the attic chain suddenly tightened and rattled violently on its own, and the wooden door creaked open just a few inches, revealing only pitch darkness inside. And from that darkness came a breath, slow and deep, and then a voice spoke again, closer this time, saying, "You shouldn't have come back." And Caleb froze because he had never been here before in his life. And then suddenly the chain snapped loudly and fell to the floor, and the attic door swung open wider by itself. And that's when he saw it, not clearly, just a tall shape standing inside the attic. Darkness completely still, watching him, and then the knocking started again, but now it wasn't just from above. It was coming from the walls, the floor, and the ceiling all at once, surrounding him, and Caleb ran back down the stairs as the lights fully went out, leaving only darkness and the sound of movement everywhere inside the house, like multiple people walking slowly in circles around him. And then the basement door under the stairs, which he hadn't noticed before, creaked open slightly on its own, even though it had been shut tight, and a cold draft came from it like something deep underground had just breathed out. And Caleb backed into the living room holding his flashlight as the knocking suddenly turned into loud banging from every direction. And then the attic footsteps started coming down the stairs slowly, one step at a time, even though nothing should have been there. And then he heard it clearly behind him, a whisper right next to his ear saying, "We were waiting for the next one." And Caleb turned around fast, but saw nothing. Only the guest book on the table flipping open by itself to a blank page, and words started appearing slowly on it, as if written by an invisible hand. "Don't look upstairs." And at that exact moment, the front door slammed shut by itself, locking with a heavy click, and the house became completely sealed in silence again. And then all at once, every window outside showed silhouettes, standing in the field, completely still, facing the house, watching, and Caleb realized none of them were moving, but all of them were now closer than before. And then the attic voice came one last time, not from above, but from everywhere at once, saying, "You already answered when you checked in." And the last thing Caleb saw before everything went completely dark was the attic door fully open and something stepping out slowly into the hallway. And after that night, the farmhouse listing disappeared from Airbnb completely, but locals in that area still report hearing knocking sounds from an empty house in the middle of the field every night after sunset, even though no one has lived there for years. And they all say the same thing. The attic door is always slightly open now, waiting for the next guest to arrive. It started with a listing that shouldn't have existed in the first place, and that alone should have stopped 31-year-old Mark Sullivan from Boston, USA, from ever clicking book. But he didn't notice the warning signs until it was already too late, because the Airbnb he reserved appeared for only a few minutes late at night before disappearing again, showing a location deep in the Appalachian Mountains with no address, no nearby roads, and no visible town, just a name, the Hollow Pine Stay. And the photos looked strangely real, but also slightly wrong, like they had been taken in low light with something always just out of frame. And the host name was listed as Carter, with no profile picture, no reviews, and no response history. But Mark still booked it because he thought it was a glitch or a hidden rental, and the moment he confirmed the reservation, he received a message that made his stomach tighten immediately. It simply said, "You will arrive before you remember leaving," and before he could even reply, the message disappeared from the chat, as if it had never been sent, but the booking remained, And that should have been the moment he canceled everything. But instead, he decided to go anyway. And the next morning, he drove toward the Appalachian region. And the deeper he went, the more his GPS started glitching, showing roads that didn't exist and then correcting themselves, while his phone slowly lost signal until there was nothing left but static silence. And when he reached the supposed location, there was no house visible at first, just thick forest and fog that seemed too dense to be natural. But then, as he stepped out of the car, he saw it, a narrow dirt path leading between trees that wasn't on any map, and at the end of it stood a cabin that looked partially hidden, like it didn't fully belong in the world. And as he walked closer, he noticed something strange immediately. There were no sounds at all, not even birds or wind, just absolute silence that felt physically heavy, and the cabin itself looked older than the listing photos, with wood that seemed slightly darker, almost wet, even though it wasn't raining, and the front door was already slightly open even though he hadn't touched anything. And that alone made him hesitate, but curiosity pushed him forward, and when he stepped inside, the air felt instantly colder. Like the temperature dropped 10 degrees in a second, and everything inside looked clean but unsettlingly staged, as if someone had arranged it for a visitor who would not stay long. And then he noticed something that made him stop completely, a large mirror placed directly facing the entrance hallway. But his reflection wasn't perfectly synced with his movements, just a fraction of a delay, and when he blinked, the reflection didn't, and he immediately looked away, telling himself it was just exhaustion. But then he heard a soft sound from above, like something slowly dragging across the ceiling, and he froze, looking up, and it stopped instantly. And for a moment, everything was silent again, until the front door behind him slowly shut on its own with a soft click. And Mark turned around fast, but no one was there, and the lock had turned itself. And that's when the real fear started, because now he was inside a locked house that had just closed itself. And then at 10:58 p.m., while he was trying to find signal on his phone, he heard the first knock coming from inside the walls, not outside, just a slow, single knock, and then silence. And Mark stood still trying to understand where it came from. And then it happened again, this time from the kitchen wall, and then from the hallway, and then from behind him, all at different times, like something was moving through the structure of the house. And then suddenly everything stopped completely, and in that silence he heard a whisper very clearly say, "You are inside now." And Mark turned around quickly but saw nothing. And then the lights flickered once, then again, and went dim, and the house felt like it had become larger somehow, like the rooms were stretching into places that didn't exist before. And then he heard footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate, walking from one end to the other, even though there was no reason for anyone to be there. And Mark slowly picked up a flashlight and moved toward the stairs, and halfway up, the footsteps stopped directly above him, and then a second set of footsteps joined in, moving in a different direction, like there were now two separate things up there. And Mark backed away slowly, but then the attic door at the end of the hallway, which he hadn't noticed before, made a faint creaking sound even though no wind was moving, and the wooden board around it looked slightly scratched, like something had been pressing against it from the inside. And then suddenly the attic chain, which he now saw wrapped tightly around the handle, started rattling violently on its own, and Mark froze as the chain slowly loosened, link by link, as if something was carefully undoing it from the other side. And then a voice came from inside the attic, low and calm, saying, "Don't let him see you." And Mark's breathing stopped because the voice was not directed at him. It was directed at something else. And then the chain snapped loudly and fell to the floor, and the attic door opened by itself just a few inches, revealing only absolute darkness. But inside that darkness, something moved closer, and the temperature dropped instantly. And Mark backed away as the whisper came again, now from behind him, saying, "You are not the first to arrive tonight." And he turned around fast, but the hallway behind him was now longer than before, stretching unnaturally, and the rooms on both sides were slightly open, and inside each room there was only darkness but the feeling of something standing just out of sight. And then the mirror at the entrance reflected something that wasn't in the room, a tall figure standing behind him. even though when he turned there was nothing there, and the knocking started again. But now it was everywhere at once, inside the floor, ceiling, and walls, like the house itself was alive. And then the front door, which had been locked, slowly unlocked itself and opened slightly, revealing only thick fog outside that hadn't been there before. And from that fog came a voice, calling softly. You checked in before you arrived, and Mark ran toward the exit. But every step he took made the hallway longer, and the attic door opened fully behind him now. And he could hear footsteps coming down the stairs slowly, one step at a time. And when he turned his flashlight back, he saw multiple shapes standing in the hallway. Not fully formed, just silhouettes watching him without moving. And then one of them spoke right next to his ear, saying, "Stay still, it's almost done." And the last thing Mark saw before everything went completely dark was the mirror showing him standing alone in the house, while something stood behind him that was no longer hidden. And after that night, the Airbnb listing disappeared permanently, but sometimes hikers in that forest say they see a cabin that appears only in fog, and if they get too close, they hear knocking from inside, even though no one is supposed to be there. And the worst part is that sometimes, on very quiet nights, the Airbnb app briefly shows the listing again for a few seconds, and the message always changes for whoever looks at it, saying, "Your stay has already begun."